Hello, everyone, and welcome to Best Practices Regarding Students with Criminal Justice Involvement, Social Work Education Recommendations. My name is Ryan Shook, and I'll be your presenter today. If we were in person, we would also have the faculty advisor, Dr. Camila Majid. And I'll quickly go over the overview of today. I'll go over a little bit about the learning objectives, the M.S.W. Code of Ethics, talk about my research questions. We'll discuss some major themes. I'll give some program recommendations, and I'll talk about the current research I'm doing, and also California's new law, AB 2138. And the learning objectives for this presentation is to identify the ethical dilemmas involved in responding equitably and consistently to students with previous criminal history, exploring how racism and other discriminatory practices in criminal justice impact potential and current social work students, identify social work values as they relate to the ethical treatment of criminal justice involvement, criminal justice involved students, and apply the NASW Code of Ethics to both clients and CGI students as they engage with clients. Learn at least 6 policy and practice approaches currently being used by other disciplines that can guide social work educational institutions in providing consistent and equitable information and support the students with criminal justice involvement. And I think it's really important that we start with the NASW Code of Ethics, particularly ethical standards 1, 4, and 5. So 1, social workers' ethical responsibility to clients, social workers' ethical responsibility as professionals, and social workers' ethical responsibilities to the social work profession. But we always want to keep those in mind as we're training new social workers and working in the field. As well as the ethical principles, particularly we'll look at social justice, so ethical principle 2, social workers challenge social injustice, as well as the dignity and worth of a person. Social workers respect the inherent dignity and worth of a person. So again, let's keep those at the forefront of everything we do and keep those at the forefront of our mind as we move through the presentation today. And it's important that we understand why we're looking at the Code of Ethics and how they apply. This is taken directly from the Code of Ethics, and it reads, ethical decisions making is a process. In situations when conflicting obligations arise, social workers may be faced with complex ethical dilemmas that have no simple answers. Social workers should take into consideration all the values, principles, and standards in this code that are relevant to any situation in which ethical judgment is warranted. Social workers' decisions and actions should be consistent with the spirit as well as the letter of the code, as well as the extent to which each standard is enforceable is a matter of professional judgment to be exercised by those for reviewing alleged allegations of ethical standards. So it's really important that we keep not only the codes in mind, but how do we apply them? And understanding that there are ethical dilemmas that could happen when we're applying these Code of Ethics. And so how do we work through those? And I'll talk about that as we move through today. And if I didn't mention it before, I am a recent graduate of California State University, Monterey Bay in the social work program. And part of our culminating project is to do a literature review. And so that's what this paper presentation is about, is my literature review. And the research questions for those is, how does a criminal background affect students entering social work programs? And how are social work programs supporting students with criminal backgrounds? And I wanted to really look at these because a lot of my undergraduate research was based around recidivism and how prison education programs are reducing recidivism, and what does that look like for those of us coming out of incarceration and into education. I want you all to really keep these questions in mind as we go through today, and how do they relate to your program? And we'll try and answer them as we go through. Who requires background checks during the application process, and how is that being used? So Are you doing background checks at the beginning of the application process? And how do you use those to determine admissions? Why do we do criminal background checks? What's the purpose? How are we applying our values and ethical principles in terms of admitting and supporting students with criminal justice involvement? CJI, you'll see that acronym as we move through, particularly values 2, social justice, and 3, dignity and worth of person. So how are we applying our values and ethical principles when we're admitting students? What are we doing to encourage and support students with criminal justice involvement to apply and complete? What is our responsibility to the profession as admitting institutions? And to whom are we to protect? And how do we do this? Now, I want to provide you a little bit of context around our prison complex system and recidivism. Over 745,000 individuals are incarcerated in city and county jails across the country. Nearly 1.5 million are in state and federal prisons, and 55% of those in the state and federal prisons are Black and Hispanic. Recidivism rates in the US is nearly 70%. However, education can reduce recidivism by 29%. So we could bring the recidivism rate down to somewhere around 40% by providing education to those that have been involved in the prison complex or justice-involved students. So who holds the keys to an education that reduces recidivism? How are we allowing students to come in? And if we hold those keys that reduce recidivism, what are we doing to allow students to enter? As I was doing the research, some major themes came out. We'll discuss each one of these, particularly current admissions policies and the use of criminal histories in higher education. So we'll look at higher education as a whole and how they're using criminal histories. We'll look at criminal histories and redemptive factors for higher education. So how are students being able to redeem themselves, and what does that look like to be able to enter into higher education? We'll look at educational programs are the gatekeepers for the professions. We know, we'll look at social work in particular. There are some other professions that just don't let students in if they have a criminal background. And then we'll look at Master of Social Work programs, admissions and field placement policies and practices. What are current programs doing? And then we'll think about ways to improve that. Current admissions policies and the use of criminal histories in higher education. So Wiseman et al. Studied 273 institutions that use the box, and I'm doing the air quotes with that, found that 66% collected criminal histories and 32% automatically denied admissions, while 46% said they might deny admissions. So Weissman's study looked at admitting institutions across the country that use the box, which asks basically, do you have a criminal background? And found that 66% of those institutions actually collect that history. In California, we don't at our public institutions. Some of the private ones, I'm sure, do though. Rosenthal et al. Studied state universities in New York, found that 62.5% that checked the box for criminal history didn't complete the application. So there's a 62.5% attrition rate for students that got to that part on the application that asked about criminal history and decided that they weren't going to continue the application. For whatever reason that they felt like they couldn't get in or was going to hold them back, but they just didn't complete. And why are institutions doing this and are asking for this? And generally, they're doing it to mitigate risk. So they think that if they can keep students out that have a criminal background, they won't be liable for things that happen on campus. And what Rosenthal and Weissman actually found is that this is just really unsupported evidence that those that commit crimes on college campuses are not repeat offenders, and they're not previously involved with the criminal justice system. And if you know anything about the Clery Act, this is why institutions are really worried about admitting students with a criminal background, is because they do have to report these incidences. And if it's found out that they reported a student, they reported an incident and the student had a criminal background and the institution allowed them in anyway, the institutions feel like they could be liable, which, as we know, is just really unsupported evidence that students that have a criminal background and are admitted to institutions are not committing crimes as the majority, as you would think. So again, this goes back to who's requiring background checks during the application process, and how is that being used? And what are you doing to encourage students to apply, and how are you supporting students with criminal justice involvement? And then again, who is most affected by the criminal justice system? And so, if in New York, 62% there's a 62% attrition rate of students not applying, how many are applying to our programs and are realizing that, if we say it up front, that you might have issues with a criminal background, and how many of those are getting to that part and just not applying, and they're not moving forward, and they're not going to realize their fullest potential. And again, who's most affected? So we know that persons of color are most affected by the criminal justice system. And so if we can think about, these individuals that are applying that get to that point and decide not to continue the application because they're criminal justice involved, we can infer that many of those would be people of color. Moving on to criminal history and redemptive factors for higher education. And so there is a lot of research around recidivism and how do those that have been affected by the criminal justice system reach redemption. And there are some key factors that we can consider. So time since release. So after 3 years, the recidivism rates drop to about 25%. So someone stays out for 3 years, it's generally, they have a 25% chance of reoffending. However, if those individuals can make it to 10 years, that rate of recidivism drops to almost 10%. And we can think about social work programs where we're requiring students to have 4 years of an education to enter the program. So do the math, right? So after 3 years, they're only a 25% chance of reoffending. We can also look at the severity of the crime. So what type of crime was committed can also be an indication of their redemption. So was it a major felony, or was it, something that they did when they were, just turning 18, which also leads to the age at the time of the crime. And what's been found is that if the first conviction is between the ages of 12 and 16, after 10 years, those individuals have the same chance of committing another crime as if they had never offended. So again, if we think about that 4 years of undergraduate education before they get to an M.S.W. program, the rate that they would reoffend during that program or after is quite low, actually. So Bordeson, Swick, and Richmond actually surveyed field supervisors. So they've surveyed 618, which is a pretty good sample size. And of those field supervisors, 94% said they would reject applicants for homicide, which, that's pretty, understandable. But 73% for drug dealing and 78% for drug manufacturing would be rejected automatically. And it's a little unnerving, I guess you would say. However, for drug convictions, they did indicate that less than half of those would admit students after 5 years, and nearly 70% would be admitted after 10 years since release or since the conviction. And again, if we go back to this, what populations are most affected by criminal conviction is particularly, drug convictions and other crimes. We can think about our, persons of color, and not to say that our persons of color are more likely to be, involved with drugs or drug manufacturing, but that's a pretty high rate. 73% would not be admitted for drug dealing and drug manufacturing, when we know that, people of color are criminalized more for having those types of crimes. Now that we've talked about the prison complex and the effects of recidivism rates and the types of crimes, let's talk about educational programs as a gatekeepers for social work profession. So we are, in essence, the ones that decide who is going to enter the profession, right? Individuals apply, they get accepted, they complete the program, and they go to work, and whether they get licensed or they go to work as a social worker in the profession. So how does someone enter that profession? Generally, it's because the institution has said, yes, you're getting in, or no, you're not getting in. And so when we think about that pathway and the gatekeeping, how are we applying our ethical standards and principles? And it poses this question: what is our responsibility to the profession as an admitting institution, and to whom are we to protect, and how do we do this? And our first ethical standard is to protect clients. And so in a lot of ways, we protect clients by doing a criminal background check and investigating individuals and whether they would be able to actually work in the profession. We know that, many states and counties do background checks. It's, employment laws. And so we do have to hold to that standard, as well as we have an ethical responsibility as professionals to maintain a level of safety. Conversely, on the other side, how do we apply our values and ethical principles of social justice and social workers challenging social injustice to our potential colleagues that have at some point experienced involvement with the justice system? And how are we applying our value and ethical principle of dignity and worth of a person to that potential colleague and student? And how are we respecting their inherent dignity and worth of their person while still trying to protect the clients? Right? And so that's where this ethical dilemma comes in, is we're trying to always protect the client, but we also have these values and principles of social justice. And again, going back to who are the most affected by the prison complex and prison system, which are our brothers and sisters of color. And if we're not allowing them to become social workers and work with us in our system because we want to protect our clients, then we're not putting forth our values and ethical principles of social justice and working against the injustices of the prison complex system. We're in a unique situation where we can make that determination to allow students into the program, unlike nursing programs that, that criminal background checks comes right up front before they even take their first class. And if you're not able to pass that criminal background check, you're just not able to even do the training, where we have some liberty that we can actually place that worth and dignity of the person ahead of their criminal justice involvement and see where they're at now and be able to actually allow students in. However, we we don't have clear policies and procedures in place. And we'll talk a little bit about what those might be or can be as we move forward. Hopefully by now, some of you are thinking, oh shoot, are we allowing students in that we shouldn't be, or are we not allowing students in because we're trying to protect the clients? And I've found this great article, and it's part of this Master of Social Work Programs Admissions and Field Placement Policies and Practices. And I call it the Great Debate. And there was this great article written in 2000 by Magan and Emmerman and Scott and Ziegler. It was a point counterpoint type of thing. And should convicted felons be denied admissions to social work programs? And I did a little bit of research on them there. It's from a school in Anchorage, Alaska. I don't know if anybody's here from there, but here are the main points from Magnan and Emmerman as to, yes, we should deny admissions, is because those that are convicted felons, they lose all their rights, right? Generally the laws say convicted felon, you lose your rights, and as professionals, we should hold them to that standard and not allow them in and not allow them to practice. And allowing them in would violate our moral code, as well as we need to keep the integrity of the profession, which again goes back to our ethical standards and principles. Particularly ethical standard 5, social workers, ethical responsibility, social work profession. And we have that responsibility to the clients, right? Again, coming back to that first ethical standard is we need to protect our clients. And so it's a risky proposition to allow convicted felons into the program and then thus go out and work in the field. Conversely, Scott and Ziegler said, no, we need to take it on a case-by-case basis and use a strengths perspective for everyone, even our colleagues. And as a recent graduate, we learned, everything was really about we learned different ways to work with clients, and how do we use their strengths to move them forward. And we're taking each individual client on a case-by-case basis, and so we should be able to apply that to the students we're allowing into the programs, as well as as our colleagues. And so we are also effective change agents, right? And we should work towards social justice, and we should identify the dignity and self-worth of a person. And so we can't just make this blanket statement that because you're a felon, you're getting denied admissions, right? We should really go to this, identify that person and what are their strengths and what are they bringing to the program and to the profession, and how are they going to be that effective change agent, and how do we support them in doing that? That's a big, tall order. It does, even for someone that identifies as justice involved and currently holds an M.S.W., I understand both of these sides, right? And so it does bring that moral dilemma that we all have to work through. So thinking about that moral dilemma, I was able to find some recent research around M.S.W. programs and their being able to place students in the field. And what I found is that there's 302 accredited M.S.W. programs in the U.S., and there's no clear standardized policy around how we as educational institutions admit, support, and help those students reach and complete their either licensing or M.S.W. Coran surveyed 146 CSW institutions and found that 62.5% have some sort of policy. It's just not standard. They vary greatly. And 90% of those don't require a criminal background check. And 58% inquired about histories, while 78% of those don't train their admissions staff in how to work with students that have a criminal background. And so there's a lot of variation there between institutions on who has a policy, what does it say, are we requiring a background check or not? And for those, if we look back at the New York universities that have that 62% attrition rate of students that get to that point, if a student realizes that there's some limitations with the criminal background and they call into the admissions office to get more information, 78% of those don't necessarily have training in how to work with our students that have a criminal background check. And so there's a lot of opportunities there, and we'll talk about some of those as we get to that part. As well as Doughton in 2018 surveyed 111 field directors, so these are the ones that work with students to place them in the field, said that 94% do affect, criminal backgrounds are affected or do affect placement. And 70% of those don't have a review process. And so what opportunities do we have there, knowing that a criminal background does affect placement for our students, and how can we implement some sort of a review process to support these students? And that's part of what we'll get to in our recommendations, as well as Velke actually did survey 23 justice-involved students. So we noticed that those other surveys are really at an institutional level, while Velke's and my current research is at the student level. They found that 75% of those students did have to do a criminal background check, and little less than half had an interview at the time of admission, and I'll talk about why that's important in a minute. And then 67% of those said that their criminal history did delay their admissions, so part of those has to be part of the interview process. It also delayed their ability to get internships and scholarships. We know, right, graduate students need money if they're trying to get scholarships, but they're being delayed because of their justice involvement. How can we speed up that process, and how can we speed up that process for them to get into an internship and the admissions process? It's hard waiting to find out, especially when we have a criminal background and we're waiting to hear if we can actually move forward. And so because of these different research that has happened recently, I was able to come up with some program recommendations that we'll discuss in a few minutes. And now we're on to the recommendation section, where we can think about in our own programs and what are we doing and how can we do better to support and admit students that have previous criminal justice involvement. And the first recommendation is social work educators can use the strengths perspective to admit and support criminal justice involved students. And so going back to one of the major tenets of our work is utilizing the strengths of the individual, whether it's a student or a client, to support them. And so how can we apply that strengths perspective to the students that are applying and being admitted? I'm kind of a theory guy, so we can think about Rogers' self-theory and the positive regard. And so if students receive a positive regard from the institution, which could be through, yes, we want to admit you, yes, we believe in you, yes, we're going to support you, that positive regard from the institution lays groundwork for a positive self-regard so that individual receives that positive self-reflection as that from that positive regard from the institution, which then equals the self-actualization of an MSW degree and possibly a licensed clinical degree. So if the institution is placing that positive regard on the student, they could self-actualize of receiving that degree. So we're really putting our teaching at the forefront of our admissions policies. We'd also do well to clearly define our language. And so if we're putting the language out there that if you have a felony or misdemeanor or other crimes, you could experience some limitations in placement and licensing and that kind of stuff. But what does that mean? What felonies, what misdemeanors, what does other crimes mean? Is there other crimes besides felonies and misdemeanors? And so really clearly defining what are those particular crimes that could pose limitations would be really helpful to those that have criminal justice involvement, as well as we can welcome and encourage potential students to contact admissions with questions about how to complete the application and what limitations there might be. And so I did a content analysis just for my own reference on California state universities and private universities in California around who has that information up front about the limitations. And it's kind of all over the board. Of the 20-something institutions, M.S.W. granting institutions in California, it really varies greatly on who has that information up front. And so do we need to put that information up front? And if we are, what does that language really say, and how can we support students that are inquiring about that? And continuing on into our recommendations for institutions is being able to allow students to present evidence of rehabilitation at a committee interview. And so this also allows us, so those that do an interview prior to admissions, is asking those students or putting that up front that, what evidence do you have of rehabilitation that we need to see as an admitting institution to, one, admit you, two, to advocate for you in fieldwork placement, as well as, employment and licensing, and encouraging those students to bring that to the committee interview, and so we can help move that forward, as well as advise applicants of potential limitations early on in the process. And so whether it's putting that information up front in the application, it's in an orientation, or it's you've been admitted and here's some limitations that might be experienced, and here's how we can support you in getting past those limitations. We can also provide coaching and mentoring through the application and field placement process. There is, and I currently work as an advisor of a peer mentor program and coaching program, and so we know that one-on-one peer mentoring and coaching from individuals in the program actually helps students succeed. And so is there a way to link current students or current faculty members with those new students coming in to provide that coaching and mentoring and support through the program and into employment to help them realize their goals? As well as potential field placements could be discussed in that interview that we were talking about before. And so knowing that a student and encouraging a student that it's okay to disclose can help them and help us provide more support to them, and helping them to identify those field placement locations early can really go a long way to support the students. And I know from experience, as I'm mentioned before, as a person that's identifies as criminal justice involved, I went to our big field placement fair, and I go up to the first table and introduce myself and hi, and one of the first questions is, do you do a criminal background check? And they say yes, and okay, thank you, and I move on to the next one. Do you do a criminal background check? Yes, we do a criminal background check. Okay, thank you, and I move on to the next table. And I went through that, and 99% of the institutions at the field placement fair do some sort of criminal background check. And so it was really disheartening for me. And luckily I had some connections in the community that I could still do my placement. But, if we provide criminal justice involved students priority to be placed at those field placement institutions that can allow a student with a criminal background to be placed there, that's a greater support to our students. And so if we have 100 students and we have 50 placements, and 3 of those placements allow students with criminal background, can we give priority to those 3 placements, to those few students? And say we have a program of 100 students, maybe 3 or 4 are criminal justice involved, but can we give priority to those students with the justice involvement to apply and be interviewed at those locations where they can actually be placed quickly without delay? And so that would be a great help to those being placed, as well as just marking those as field placement opportunities, as well as assisting students in overcoming barriers to the licensing employment. And so as they get towards that part, how are we helping them overcoming that? And whether it's gathering documents or giving them the information right up front, can be really helpful. And I'll talk about the new California law in just a second. So I did complete the literature review around the subject, and as I was completing it, it was fall of last year, and then talking to Dr. Majid and wanting to really move this to doing some empirical research and look at students, particularly on the West Coast. A lot of the research was done on the East Coast, and more at the institutional level. I wanted to really do this and survey B.S.W. students, M.S.W. students, and doctoral students, D.S.W. students, on their experiences, those that have a criminal justice involvement, and also those of the students in the classroom. It took me a while before I actually disclosed that I had a criminal justice involvement in the classroom. And so how are those students being treated by other students? How are they being treated by faculty? And what support are they receiving? And so this current research project started in the spring with the IRB, the Institutional Review Board process, and then COVID happened, everything shut down, and so it kind of got delayed. So we were really hoping to present some of those findings with you today. However, we've been, like everybody else, we're behind about 6 months in the actual research. But the research is about assessing students' perceptions of support received by their institution during the admissions, the field placement, and the licensing process. And that information is starting to come in. We're also looking at how and when background checks are being administered, and when students become aware of the fact that a criminal history could have some limitations. Is it prior to admissions? Is it after being admitted, but before field placement? Or is it while they're trying to find field placement? And I come from a 3-year program where the first year is all in the classroom. The second year, we are in our field placement, and the third year, we're in field placement. So because I knew about the limitations early of my own accord, and I had some connections to the community because I'd already kind of worked around in the field a little bit, I was able to get a placement that my criminal justice involvement didn't matter as much, but I could see where a student going through the first year of classroom work and then going to that field fair like I did and going from table to table and finding out that a criminal background check needed to be done and that maybe potentially not being able to be placed because of that could have really affected my time. And so I want to know, how are students being supported, and how are how supportive are the institutions in the pursuit and placement of knowing the limitations. And so, are the field placement liaisons or directors or whatever they're being called, how are they actually supporting those students knowing that there's a limitation there? And that's what this research really is based around. And so kind of, and give you just a little bit of insight, is that the students that don't have criminal background feel pretty supported when they're getting placed, but those that do have the criminal background really feel almost unsupported. And so I think we could do better as an institution in supporting these students that disclose the limitations early. And I'd really like to invite you all, if you're students, to go ahead and take out your phone and put it on picture mode and just put it up to the QR code there. You'll be linked to the survey. It takes 2 to 3 minutes to complete. You can also copy down that link if you're a faculty member or a dean or somebody who would like to get this research out to your own students. Please do that. I would appreciate that. It is been approved by our institutional review board, which means that the institution, has approved the personal research. So please get it out to your students if you can. If you're a faculty member administrator and you would like to provide some feedback around what we've been talking about, or around you want to give us some insight into your own program, there's an opportunity there. Again, you can take out your phone and put it on picture mode and put it up to the QR code, and that would take you to the link. Or you can copy down that short bit.ly link. I'll leave this up here for a few minutes so you can copy that stuff down. Please get it out to your students. This is pretty important research, and there's not a lot of published research that's been done in this area. I'll give you a few more seconds. Again, if you'd like to see the institutional review board approval, I can send that over as well. And in the midst of my own research and thinking about my own potential licensing after the social work degree, wondering if I could actually get, be approved for a license through our Board of Behavioral Science, I realized that there was a new California law that has been passed with the help of the Rehabilitation and Inclusion Council in conjunction with the M.S.W, so in California. And what this AB 2138, Chu was the writer of this, is called the Fair Chance for Occupational Licensing. And it helps those with a criminal record obtain a professional license. Again, it's AB 2138, and it went into effect July 1st of 2020. So it's just 11 months now that it's been in effect. And it actually is not just for social work licensing, it's for contractors and many other types of professions that need state license in order to work. And so it's really, I think, sort of groundbreaking for us to move this forward. And here's some of the major provisions of AB 2138. It says that a license cannot solely be denied on the basis of most criminal convictions that are 7 years or older. So again, if we think about that redemption time, right? Time since release. How does someone that has a previous criminal background but has been, on the straight and narrow, and I'm doing air quotes, for some time, how do they redeem themselves and be able to get this license? And so they've sort of put in this 7-year mark as a tentative. After 7 years, maybe we won't really look at those offenses, with the exception of some serious offenses that are Tier 1 and Tier 3 sex offenses, and I'll show you what those are in the next slide. They can't be denied on the basis of convictions that have been dismissed those are California penal codes, essentially convictions that have been expunged or reduced, or if a person has received a certification of rehabilitation or a pardon. We all know what a pardon is, but California in particular has a certification of rehabilitation. So there's kind of a lot that goes into that, but generally someone that has, completed their probation, parole, sentence, and has done well for a period of time. Maybe they've gone to school, maybe they've gotten a social work degree, they've completed maybe treatment program, or they completed domestic violence or something like that. They can present that information to the courts, and they could actually get a certificate of rehabilitation. And so when I was talking about that earlier at an interview, is there a point where a student or a potential student can present that certificate of rehabilitation or some sort of factors that show, yes, I committed these crimes in the past, but that's not who I am now. This is what I've done. As well as it can be denied on the basis of arrest, diversions, deferment, entry of judgment, so deferred judgment, infraction, citation, or juvenile adjudication. So they committed a crime when they were young, but it had been adjudicated. And so what type of crimes can be considered even after 7 years? So maybe, 8, 10 years earlier. Some serious felonies listed under the California Penal Code. So serious felonies might be murder or attempted murder, voluntary manslaughter, distribution of drugs to a minor. So I think that's important because, we heard earlier about some institutions not really wanting to allow individuals that had drug dealing or drug manufacturing as part of their crimes, while this new law says that, you could still be licensed if those offenses for manufacturing or drugs is earlier than 7 years, as long as you weren't actively distributing to minors. First degree burglary, carjacking, grand theft involving a firearm, or kidnapping. So we can see that those could be considered serious felonies. And so when we talk about the language, like I did earlier around, clearly defining our language of felony, misdemeanor, or other crimes, having some sort of list like this, like these are some particular convictions that are going to be really hard to overcome when getting a license or, getting a job in the field. And then the Tier 2 or Tier 3 sex offenses would include, rape, sodomy and force, sex trafficking, sex offenses involving minors under the age of 14, incest or habitual sex offenses. Again, if we're thinking about how do we protect our clients, is that's our first ethical responsibility is to our clients. We're not talking about admitting any and all individuals with a criminal background. Are there some guidelines that we could put in place that says, if you have these Tier 2 or Tier 3 in California at least of, rape, including sodomy and by force, sex trafficking, sexual offense, that these are ones that are a standard sort of no-go, that we could pretty much you could be denied on the basis of these. Otherwise, let's have a conversation about your convictions and time since conviction would be really helpful. And I want to reiterate that these slides, these last 3 slides, have come from the Rehabilitation Inclusion Council of NASW California. And like I said before, is the Council on Rehabilitation and Inclusion, which is part of the NASW California, helped to get that law in place. And I wanted to make sure that I provided you with their contact information if any of you are interested in finding more about the work that they're doing, or the law that they were able to get on the books. So I want to leave this up for just a couple of minutes for you to take down any of that information. Again, it's the Rehabilitation and Inclusion Council, which is part of NASW California, and they're doing great work around policy in our state. We are at the point in the presentation where we would normally be having a very robust discussion and taking questions and learning about what you all are doing at your home institutions and states. And we obviously can't do that, but please feel free to contact myself, Ryan Shook, or Dr. Majid. Our email address is there. We'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, your comments, your concerns, what's working for you, what's not working for you. Did this spark any interest? Are you now rethinking the way that you admit students, or have you implemented some amazing sort of policies and practices that we could share with our own home institution? As we at California State University, Monterey Bay, we would like to be able to implement some practices too. So please let us know what your thoughts and feelings are. Again, I'm Ryan Shook, and Dr. Majid is the faculty advisor for the research. And here are some of the references that have been cited in the research. If you'd like a full list of references from the complete literature review, please contact me and I will share those with you. Or if you think there's something that I missed, I'd be happy to hear about that too.